Hey Gautam, can you hear me?
Yeah, Arjun. Hi.
Hi, nice to meet you.
Yeah, likewise.
Cool.
Okay, so Arjun, we are on stage. We're live.
Yeah.
We'll give it like 15, 20 seconds and then we can start.
Cool, sounds good.
All right.
And I can say share screen as well, right?
Yes, you can. Yeah.
Cool. Uh, share screen. Okay. Yeah, just let me know when I'm good to start. I'm good anytime.
Yes, definitely. Yeah.
Cool.
Well, we can start now. Okay, so hello everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We have Arjun Arora with us. He's the co-founder and CEO of Betafi, which is an end-to-end UX research platform that allows companies to recruit testers, test, and synthesize in one place. So, quick intro about Arjun. He's an experienced product marketing manager with a history of working in the telecommunications industry. He has a passion for new startups, products, working with different cultures, because having spent a year overseas with National University of Singapore's overseas college program focused in technopreneurship from the University of Pennsylvania. It's a pleasure having you on board, Arjun. The stage is yours.
Thanks, Gautam. Thanks. Pleasure to be here. And thanks for a wonderful intro. You did a great job, much better than I was going to.
Thank
Um,
you.
so yeah, just spending a little bit time on myself. As Gautam mentioned, I'm currently the CEO and co-founder of Betafi, a platform which we are building to help product teams build the right thing from day one. So we really believe that in the product development process, getting customer feedback is important, and we are building a platform that makes this process easier. And before this, I was a PM at Singtel, which is a telecom company in Singapore, where I launched this product called Gomo, which is Singtel's digital brand. Built it from scratch to about 100K users and 30 million revenue. So that's a bit about me. So what are we going to talk about today? Um, I was really passionate about how do you decide like this is the idea to pursue for your startup. A lot of us are working in different companies and in product roles. We have a lot of ideas coming thick and fast. I was someone like this as well, where a lot of things are pretty interesting to me, but it's hard to decide which is something worth pursuing. So over the next 15 minutes or so, I will just walk you through what was my thought process around Betafy, and then would love to hear questions. Right. So exactly 1 year ago, in like August and September of this year, I was at crossroads of sorts. Whether to continue my life at Singtel, I was doing well as a PM there, but I'd already worked there for 5 years, or like all good people, go for MBA or a startup, right? But I wasn't sure which was the best approach to me. And if I do a startup, I couldn't really decide, like, how do you decide which is the idea worth doing? How do you find a co-founder? There's so many different challenges, right? So I started with this accelerator. I joined the accelerator program called Entrepreneur First a year ago exactly, just to evaluate that. But today I will talk more about when I was joining Entrepreneur First, and there's only 3 months on deciding what's an idea worth doing. Why did I go on Betafy? Why did I go after the problem of getting customer feedback for product teams? And what was it about the process that convinced me that this is definitely an idea worth doing? So, interestingly, why I spend a bit of time explaining about Gomo and Singtel at the top is because it started at Gomo. So, right before I joined EF and I started working on Betafy, I was doing Gomo for the last 2 years. It was interesting because it started as a hacky side project where me and a couple of other folks just hacked it together for 3 4 months. Then we got approval, and then it became very very big. So from it was from 0 to 30 million in revenue in 1 year. We built it in Singapore, then grew it in Indonesia, Australia, Thailand. It was very very successful. But the bigger lesson for me was, like, why aren't more of the digital projects successful? Gomo was one of the very rare products that to come out in the last 5 years that I was there to be successful. But why is it that even though big companies talk about digital all the time, digital transformation and all of that, but in actual fact, coming up with new products is really really hard. And my hypothesis that was in this whole process of building digital products, there are a lot of skill sets, a lot of tools are lacking, a lot of processes are not ideal, and this should be a space I want to do something in. So that was like the high level area of interest for me when I was getting started. But the very specific reason why I came towards getting feedback, especially before the product is built, was this particular incident when I was building Gomo. So one of my designer built this checkout flow, and this is the new version of it, but the old version of it had like a promo code field just as you're checking out, and it was like blue on blue. So the background was blue, this was blue. And before launch, we had done like no feedback on the flow. We just were in the like habit of just launching stuff, and it was one of the things that I had highlighted that if you have something like that in the because the telco plan is hard to buy, and if you have a flow like that, then people will miss it. And indeed, it happened. So the moment we launched it, we had like every single day 20 to 30 people who would miss it, and then they will write and call into customer care and ask for waiver. And in 1 month, we lost about 20,000 in revenue. And to me, it was like, why aren't these things like part of the product development process already? Why don't we get feedback before we build? So this is how I went from a broader problem of I want to do something to make the process of building digital products better, to narrowing down the problem of I want to get the process of getting feedback while building digital products better. That's how I narrowed down the problem. And at the same time, I was in EF. I met my co-founder who was working in Stripe. And one of the interesting things he brought about was he was an engineer, and he said because we didn't take feedback in the early part of the process when they're at design stage, engineers have to do a lot of rework. So one of the interesting things he shared was as an engineer, he had to rebuild the onboarding flow 3 times because no feedback was taken at an early stage. So that's how we narrowed down the idea from oh, I want to do something which makes product management easier, digital product management easier, to I want to get to feedback, to I want to get feedback at the earlier stage even before coding is started. So this was the idea. We narrowed it down. We were both super excited. But then the big question is, how do you know this is worth doing? You only have 3 months. You're just meeting a new co-founder. How do you not go for MBA or continue your like corporate career and continue building this? So there are three main things that we did, and I think there's a lot of like articles out there, but it definitely starts by talking to a lot of customers. The problem I faced and my co-founder faced, where there's not much feedback done before things are launched, and then there's a lot of recovery. Is that a more universal problem, or is it like our problem? So we started by speaking to almost 200 different customers. I know that's a bit much, but because we started with a very wide problem of customer feedback, we wanted to cover people across diverse customer profiles, like small companies and big companies, even design agencies, market research agencies. We wanted to talk to designers, researchers, PMs, engineers, right? Different people in India, people in the US, just to see if this was really a problem that we were finding. And one of the very interesting things from this process was that we were of the opinion that people did not want to talk to customers. But actually, what came back was, of course, everyone wanted to talk to customers and get feedback. Who doesn't get feedback? But the process of getting feedback is hard and time consuming and is not representative. So, those are some of the things you learn. Um, and while we were talking to customers, there were actually at the early stage only 2 or 3 key assumptions that we were trying to validate. One, do people and product teams care about user research? Two, is it painful enough? Is there anything even wrong with the current process that we need to change? And three, who does the research? We intuitively knew that yeah, this process is painful, right? But who in the company is it painful for was the thing. And the fourth thing was, as we were talking to these 200 people, we realized like synthesizing this information and gaining insights from it is really hard. Like like as we were doing our own research, there were three big pain points that emerged. Number one is where will you find 200 people to talk to? So I had to do a crazy amount of outreach to LinkedIn, through friends, to Slack communities, and I just reached out to, I think, at least 4 or 5 thousand people. But in general, just reaching out to people is hard. The second thing was, in our own process, talking to these people, right? Like taking the time, arranging a call, setting context, rescheduling, scheduling. These logistics of the call is hard. So this is what we were facing. And the third part was, which we still struggle to solve today, is there's so much feedback, there's so many rants. How do you crystallize them into things which are meaningful problems, right? And the way we did about this was, so we did this approach of, first we went wide. The first 20 or so interviews were very open-ended. Purposely, tell us about your research process, tell us about your product development process, just to hear different sides of the equation. And then as we got sharper and sharper, we both went deeper into the insights, as well as we went into a certain set of customers which we felt this problem is not solved for at all. So for example, initially we went for all sorts of customer profiles, but quickly we realized, for bigger companies, yes, this is painful, but they can get agencies to solve it for them. So maybe the first people to approach are SMBs or startups, which would be more helpful for us, or even design agencies. The other thing we did to maintain a cadence of this process is, around every 30 or 40 interviews, we had this interview template that we maintained, so that the feedback we captured is kind of consistent. Every 30, 40 interviews, we'll go and update the template so that we know like what we are finding out for is evolving, right? And this process is both super informative, and they're like aha moments where you're like that builds conviction, right? Of course, the sample size and the depth of the interview also helps, but there are certain things that certain people say that really stick out. So we, as with anyone building a new product, we like to assume that, oh, there are not enough tools, no one's solving this problem. But the golden feedback we got was that the problem is not that there's no tool, but there are too many tools, and you cannot expect an average person to use 3 to 4 tools just to do one research. Like, that's the problem that exists today. So that sort of becomes like our customer pain point we want to focus on, right? But customer pain point is one lens, is definitely the most important lens. I think is the most important thing to build conviction. But just like you need to be sure of whether this is, like, in the people you're talking to, this is a like deep and painful problem, you also need to take another lens to understand whether this is a representative problem across a lot of different people, right? So especially for us, we were narrowing it down to the problem of early stage product feedback or UX research. And one of the very obvious concern was that the market for UX research is small. Like, how many companies do you know that do UX research on a regular basis? Not once a quarter, or once in 6 months, once a month, twice a month, right? So what are the big trends? We intuitively knew this was changing, but what are the facts which are not our opinion and not just the opinion of those people we talk to? So I think the first and most encouraging trend we picked up was that, in general, the product-led growth motion was picking up, and with that, people were really obsessing over design. So when we were starting out, initially UX research was big in like e-commerce companies, or like those Food Panda, Grab sort of apps. But over time, we saw even B2B SaaS companies really being particular about design, or even big enterprises. And a proof point that proves that was the growth in product management jobs, the design jobs between 2015 to 2020 was insane, and it was across markets. So this was very encouraging. The other key trend for us was, with Figma becoming really big in the last 3 or 4 years, uh, getting to a prototype stage quickly was becoming easy for people. So even though they don't do like UX research properly, like in a proper way, but anyone can hack a prototype quickly and get feedback on it as they build, and that was encouraging for us. As we stepped back into the bigger enterprises to see if this trend was also doing, we saw a lot of big companies starting to move away from the agency model, even in the 6 or 8 months we've been running the company. And the reason is, agency model is prohibitively expensive, and it makes a lot of sense once you do research once in 3 months, 4 months. But as they adopt agile practices for real, um, then a lot of this is more frequent, like once a month and so on. And that was the third thing. And the third thing was simply that people get feedback in informal ways or whatever, but often they just sit with the person and show them the product, get feedback face to face. But with COVID and remote work becoming the norm, this suddenly became like a virtual overnight. So you can't suddenly sit next to your friend, get feedback. Now you also have to share prototype and share screen. And this was a new problem that the pandemic created. And we were of the belief that once people start doing it virtually, they would not go back to face, or at least face to face would not be the norm. Yeah. So these were the trends, but there were also a couple of like wow moments, because we were looking at some of, so this industry had like a couple of competitors which started in 2008 or 2009, and they were pretty small all the way to 2015. But since 2017, as we saw user research pick up, both of those competitors in the 3 or 4 years reached 100 million ARR very, very quickly. And like we were not scared by this trend at all. We were super encouraged because they just showed us that the market is growing very, very fast. And the other article, this is just funny, Anderson Horowitz wrote this article around user research platform. I know they should not be part of conviction, but they just articulated the pain points that we were talking about really, really succinctly. Yeah. So the first thing to summarize again was talking to a lot of customers. The second thing was looking at some proof points in this larger problem space. Yeah. The third thing which I felt was super necessary in building conviction, and maybe this is a little bit more relevant for SaaS companies or product companies, is because there will be tools out there. A lot of them are free tools. You can go out and research. We really spend the time going through and using all our competitive tools to genuinely get the appreciation of, at a high level, yes, we know what's the problem, but very specifically, what is it that these tools are missing, right? And there were two main categories of these. One were the specialist user research tools. A lot of those were focused on like unmoderated research. So unmoderated research is sort of like asynchronous, where you just share your prototype and the person does the research. You don't talk to them face to face. Also, these tools were really, really specialized. So people had to use only very expert people sort of use these tools. They were not a general purpose tool which anyone in the company can use. Then there were also the more normal tools which everybody knew how to use, whether it's Zoom or Google Meet or Notion. But again, this fact of cobbling together 3 to 4 different tools just do your research made that problem was not possible. Yeah. But the really again interesting trend was that post COVID, right, all these user interviews were virtual, right? They're virtual. And at that point, people were not building for that use case. So that use case was really missing, specifically when it came to things like sharing prototypes, collaborating among different team members. So there were situations like people use Zoom for interviews, and 6 people join a call and interviewing one poor person, and you're just like overwhelming the user, because unlike face to face, you cannot just have an observer mode. Yeah. Or for example, you're testing prototypes on mobile, for example, right? And mobile is really hard to do through Zoom. So these were some of the things we observed because we used the tools ourselves. We went to look at their app store ratings and their reviews. We clearly identified what is it that they were not addressing, and therefore that would be like a good starting point for us. Yeah. So I think, just to wrap up my monologue, I think ultimately to build conviction, you really need to be excited about the problem space. Startup is hard, and if you're trying to solve something you personally felt, it's definitely a lot easier. And if you have a little bit of context about the industry or the domain, it helps as well. And in the process of deciding what you should do, uh, there are 3 things I've covered in the talk, and I will summarize again. First, go and validate with the users that do they really have this problem in an unbiased way with a big enough group of users. Two, go and think through and collect what are the proof points that this is a big enough problem, that you're not just solving it for a very small uh, group of users. And three, look through what are the other ways they solve this problem, and figure out what are those suggestions. So those were just some of the thoughts I thought I would share, and would love to hear any questions.
Great, thank you so much, Arjun. So I think we have another 5 minutes, and we have a couple of questions. So the first question is from Snehal. The question is, I quickly read about your company, Beta 5. Don't your customers fear of leaking their idea? How do you ensure them about their privacy?
Yeah. So typically in this domain, that there are like confidential forms that are signed through the platform. So basically, if you're coming in to give feedback for something, you can share that, oh, you agree that it's confidential for this research use case. That's the norm practice. But generally, I think leaking of the idea is not much of a concern, or much lesser of a concern than what I first thought when I just joined this space. Yeah.
All right, great. So the next question is from Rahul. Like Arjun, how to identify the best 100 to 200 customers to get feedback from them about the product?
Yeah, I think this is a really good question. So to start with, you have to go wide, right? So in this case, we were thinking of getting feedback for the product. So start with who will give feedback for the product. So the first 20 or so customers were really anyone who's willing to talk to me, because the problem statement is still amorphous. We are also ourselves figuring out how do I zoom in on the problem. I think once you get there, and once you kind of figure out who your target audience is. So in our case, we wanted to talk to head of design, head of product, and product designers more than product managers or user researchers. So then we go for that particular profile. Among them, we typically go for events and see, because they are in this field, a lot of people write about this already. So start with those folks first, or those who come for events like this. Start with those people first, because they would have felt the problem. But one thing I would like to say is it's really important to interview both, like someone at like a more leadership role, who can understand or appreciate the strategic value of this, but also someone who actually does the research, because the pain points they face and the challenges they face are very different.
All right. So we have one more from Kushal Raj. He says, Arjun, did you create a UI prototype before seeking validation, or started just with a thesis and spoke about it?
Yeah, a good question. So we actually did it in many parts. At the very start, it was literally started with a thesis, write down some questions. Even if we have some screenshots is not prototypes. So we literally would explain what we are trying to do. For example, we will say, oh, you can automatically get insights after the call. People would not get it. That's fine. That's the start. So I said share just now about 200 conversations. A good 40, 50 of those were about that. But as we sort of kind of got more specific into what exactly the problem was, then we started mocking those things. So yes, then we had a UI prototype, but we did not UI prototype the entire product. We UI prototype those parts we want to get feedback on. So we wanted to check if like we kind of invert the screen sharing process through our tool. And this was a big thing because it's different from how Zoom or Google Meet works. So we definitely need a UI mockup of that, because we want to show people how it works before we spend the time building it. Yeah.
We have 2 more minutes. So if you have any questions, you can feel free to ask. Yes, we have a question from Abhijit. How to identify biased feedback during the initial user validation stage?
Yeah, also a very interesting and a very real problem. I think there are a few ways of doing it. One is if the person starts ranting, and I mean even even though you can do a lot of best practices to interview, but there will be some people who will just go and rant. For example, they will say like, "Oh, technology or tools can never help you. This is all a human thing. Like only good researchers can like identify problems and not human beings." So I think in respect of their time, you still have to listen to them. But generally, a rant is one way to identify biased feedback. Another way is and one of the things I always do is after getting a feedback which is kind of new or contradictory, I ask them, is this something they face across their different jobs they've worked in, or is it only a problem in this company? Because if it's a problem in this company, then that may not be relevant, right? The third way to do it is kind of like at that point let them rant, but at the end come back to like a paraphrase the question to say, is this your top three pain points that you would pay for, or bring a different lens to the same question and see how this insight comes out. So these are 2 or 3 ways to weed out that feedback.
Right. Thanks for that, Arjun. Yep. So that's the end of today's session. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Yeah, and special thanks to Arjun for putting up such a good presentation. Thanks a lot, Arjun. So for the audience, we have a lot of sessions coming up. So stay tuned. The next session starts in 5 minutes. We'll see you soon.
Thanks,
Thank
guys.
you.
Thanks for the question as well. Yeah.